But we are beginning with this scene in a Wichita, Kansas courtroom today. Just before the judge sentenced to life in prison the man who murdered abortion provider Dr. George Tiller. The convicted murderer, anti-abortion extremist Scott Roeder, interrupted his own sentencing hearing today during the testimony of a psychologist who was called to the stand by Roeder's own defense team. Watch.
His logic, his reasoning was that he was following God's law.
Through murdering which God condemns in the...
To protect unborn babies.
Your Honor,
I'm talking, I just can't stand it. Let's get this out here.
You're going to be removed from the courtroom if you don't settle down.
After that, Mr. Roeder spoke on his own behalf for more than 40 minutes. As Cliff Judy, a Wichita TV reporter who was covering the trial, pointed out today, Mr. Roeder spent about 25 minutes of that time speaking on his own behalf, reading from somebody else's book. Reading from a book written by a man named Paul Hill. Who's Paul Hill? Paul Hill is part of the web of anti-abortion extremist violence that appears to have inspired Scott Roeder to murder George Tiller. In July 1994, Paul Hill shot and killed Dr. John Britton and a 74-year-old clinic escort named James Barnett. He also injured James Barnett's wife. That killing followed another killing of Dr. David Gunn, who was shot and killed by another anti-abortion extremist as he arrived at his Pensacola, Florida clinic in March of 1993. The man who killed Dr. Gunn was named Michael Griffin. Michael Griffin was associated with a group called Rescue America. Rescue America responded to Dr. Gunn's killing by saying that while they didn't condone it, they certainly didn't condemn it either. The violence continued after that. In December 1994, an anti-abortion extremist named John Salvi killed 2 receptionists and wounded 5 other people at 2 clinics in Massachusetts. In January of 1998, a security guard named Robert Sanderson was killed. A nurse named Emily Lyons was seriously wounded by a nail bomb that was set off at an Alabama abortion clinic. That bomb was set by Eric Rudolph, who had also bombed another abortion clinic and a gay bar in Atlanta in 1997. Eric Rudolph became famous, of course, for also bombing the Atlanta Olympics. He killed 1 person and wounded 11 others. In October of 1998, Dr. Barnett Slepian was killed inside his home. Inside his home in Amherst, New York, he was killed by an anti-abortion extremist named James Kopp, who was armed with a sniper rifle. And, of course, on May 31st of last year, Scott Roeder walked into the Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas, and shot and killed Dr. George Tiller while Dr. Tiller was serving as an usher for Sunday services. In January of this year, Scott Roeder was convicted of premeditated murder. He admitted during his trial that he had stalked Dr. Tiller for years before killing him. Today, Scott Roeder sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole for 50 years. It's what's known in Kansas as the hard 50. The judge could have given Mr. Roeder a sentence that would have allowed for parole eligibility in 25 years. The sentence he got, however, the hard 50, means that 52-year-old Scott Roeder will very likely die in prison. At the sentencing today, perhaps the single most amazing thing about it was when Scott Roeder called character witnesses. Scott Roeder called character witnesses to urge the judge to give him the lesser sentence. These witnesses sealed beyond a shadow of a doubt Mr. Roeder's ties to the broader extremist anti-abortion movement, the fact that this wasn't one crazed guy acting alone, the fact that this was intended as an act of domestic terrorism. 2 of Scott Roeder's character witnesses were Regina Dinwiddie and David Leach. Dinwiddie and Leach are both signatories to a document that's called the Defensive Action Statement. That statement explicitly supports the use of violence against abortion providers.
His heart was with the babies. He was always cool, but he was never cold. But he's good, hardworking, productive member of this society who loves his country and doesn't belong in prison, Your Honor.
I think everyone will agree he honestly believed that he could do some good, and he was willing to sacrifice his own freedom and life itself for others. I think everyone here can agree with that, and yet I also expect almost everybody here in this courtroom will blanch if I say he was motivated by love. And yet, Willingness to offer your life for others precisely meets the Bible's very definition of love.
In the aftermath of Dr. Tiller's murder, the first person you saw speaking there, Regina Dinwiddie, she told CNN that the murder was, quote, absolutely justified. She told the Associated Press that she was glad about George Tiller's death. She said at the time, quote, I wouldn't cry for him no more than I would if somebody dropped a rat and killed it. For his part, David Leach publishes a newsletter that's called the Prayer and Action News. It's a newsletter to which Scott Roeder subscribed and submitted articles. After George Tiller's murder, Dave Leach spoke to the Associated Press about Scott Roeder, saying, quote, he will be the hero. He will be the hero to thousands of babies who will not be slain because Scott sacrificed everything for them. He told the Iowa Independent, quote, so far the Bible discussion I have seen overwhelmingly supports anyone willing to sacrifice everything in order to physically stop an abortionist from killing thousands of babies. Last year, Dave Leach tried to auction off, among other things, a Prayer and Action News Army of God edition. He wanted to auction this off to benefit Scott Roeder's legal defense. It's a handbook for using force against abortion clinics. When George Tiller was killed last year by Scott Roeder, it was not the first time that he had been shot by people from this domestic terrorist movement. In fact, Scott Roeder had said that he had visited a woman named Shelley Shannon while she was in prison in Topeka, Kansas. She was in prison for shooting George Tiller. She shot him in both arms in 1993. Dr. Tiller knew exactly what he was up against with this movement determined to use force and murder to get its way. But he believed in what he was doing. He thought it was important to provide the service that he provided to women. At his funeral, a giant floral arrangement spelling out Dr. Tiller's motto was put up in the church. It spelled out, trust women. Joining us now is Judy Burkhart, who worked closely with Dr. Tiller for 8 years. She now directs the Trust Women PAC. It focuses specifically on doctors who provide the kind of services that Dr. Tiller provided and the task of protecting legal access to those services across the country. Ms. Burkhart, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having me.
What's your reaction to today's sentencing? Do you feel that justice was served?
Well, I feel that the hard 50 was the right sentence, and Scott Roeder will, as he most certainly should, spend the rest of his life in prison. This does not stop the anti-choice terrorism that physicians and staff members face, and this certainly, most certainly, does not bring back one of the most caring and compassionate men I've ever known.
Scott Roeder clearly wants to be seen as a martyr to the anti-abortion cause. I keep mindful of that when we play the statements today from his people who I would consider to be his co-conspirators in the movement, who spoke on his behalf today. We saw it in him invoking and lionizing other people who have killed abortion providers. Are you worried that there's a risk that the resolution of this case today could incite more violence, could spark more violence from these people?
Yes, most certainly. When you see anti-choice terrorists such as Scott Roeder answering to another rule of law and not to the laws that we have in the United States, I'm afraid that it does. With the inflammatory language that is used, baby killer, murderer, the use of Holocaust, this incites violence, and this is like yelling fire in a crowded theater.
I know that you worked with Dr. Tiller for 8 years, during which time he was very cognizant of the physical threats that he faced. What was that like to work in that kind of environment in which you knew that you were physically being targeted every day that you went to work?
Well, I would say that after a while, one would become rather immune to that, or it was not something that one would think about on a daily basis.
I know that Dr. Tiller's attorney talked about the impact of his death being like an earthquake. He said it would leave women who needed the services that Dr. Tiller provided to ask, where can I go, what will I do? What do you think the larger impact is of Dr. Tiller's murder on the availability of the services that he provided?
Well, we've